Hello, thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation to the center, and especially to Margaret Cabanis, whose idea joined with me this was. I thought I'd start by asking you a question that you don't need to answer, especially as you're eating, and that is if you have ever thought about the fact that some of the greatest friendships we have heard about are between people of the same sex, such as, for example, the friends and fellows in the Fellowship of the Ring, or the similarly famous friends in Sex and the City, not to speak of Little Women or the Inklings. At the same time, I'm sure that we all know that Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady was right when he said something like, "Put a woman in my life and everything gets unstable and distorted," and the ladies could say the same of the opposite sex. So it's not that there is a possible world like the one my friend was telling me about yesterday when he gave me advice for this talk, and we walked through the greens in the late hours after the conference that finished yesterday, where I saw some of you. And he who now is married and is struggling with the difficulty of pursuing or not pursuing his friendships with women which pre-exist his marriage, as perhaps will be the case for you in the future, in case you either marry off or have such friendships, and or both. He was saying to me how much better was the world of me and my brothers, and me and my brothers at the dorm, and me and my group of male friends in high school, and so on. But that's not real. As in this room, we are surrounded by people of the opposite sex, which is why I think it is important to have ideas in store so as to go efficiently around the problem or the topic of what I sometimes call mixed friendships. This is an argument for grown-ups. For example, Hermione Granger, growing up, when she wasn't a grown-up, let's say that precocious as she was, she probably was a grown-up at the age of 11 or something like that. But when she was a little bit younger, she could befriend her two best friends in a way that probably wasn't very different from the one she would have befriended two girls. Those guys, Ron and Harry, in many ways, they were not men for her. So it's important for us to know if we are like Hermione at the age of 7, at the age of 11, at the age of 13, or maybe we grew up to the present age, but we haven't matured sufficiently, in which case maybe we can be like Hermione, and maybe we can have a friendship with a person of the opposite sex to which none of what I will say applies. We are in the age of bliss, where we experience a certain innocence that covers our eyes so that we don't see Eve the way Adam saw her when he exclaimed what he did and decided to espouse her. Is it good if we are like Hermione at the age of 20 or so? That's a question and a topic for another day. I'll just say that perhaps you're not there yet, where what I will say today matters. Perhaps it will matter one day. Maybe that day will be tomorrow, or maybe it will be when you get married, or when you enter some commitments that you want to preserve. In which case, these remarks can operate as a cautionary tale, so that in the future, if you are not there yet, if the future is not the present for you, as I'm sure it is for some of you, then if you reach that point, you are not caught unaware. You are more like Charles Ryder in arriving to Brideshead in 1945 when he says, "I have been here before," to Hooper. So maybe these remarks may have a similar function, so that if you face a difficult situation one day having to do with today's topic, you say, "Wait, I have been here before. I attended this talk one time where I was warned that these feelings that now I have and I hadn't then, they are there. What to do with them so that I won't be trapped in a way that will be against my best interest in that future that may be the present for you." I will also say that the argument doesn't really apply if you are in what I will call, without pejorative connotations, a hunting mood, like in the look for a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend. You are unattached. You are not otherwise engaged. Not only you aren't married, you are looking for a spouse, for a boyfriend, for a girlfriend, in which case none of what comes next applies to you. In fact, it does, but in a reverse way. You will want to befriend people of the opposite sex because you know those won't be the friendships I'll talk about today. They'll only be a sliding way towards something perhaps better, but certainly different from the friendship I'll talk about today. So I'll exclude from the argument many levels of friendship, and I will isolate only one, and I will say about this one that it is impossible between men and women. I would like to call it today the beer friendship, but you can substitute beer for bowling, for whiskey, or whatever is your preferred activity, with the type of friend with whom you will not check anything you say and with whom you will share everything you feel. It's typically nighttime with that friend with a capital F, and there might be a drink or two on the table. That's the friendship I'm going to rule out as possible between men and women. I also learned a new verb, and that is to mooch, M-O-O-C-H. I can see that you are acquainted with it. I was not, but I received an explanation in a completely different context, and I thought, mooching is the kind of thing you do with the type of friend I want to exclude from the friendship between men and women. Carelessly wander, like maybe through the forest on the way to the other side of the lake, perhaps in the evening hours. That's what you do with a friend, or with your sister, or with your brother. Yes, those, of course, can be your friends if you are lucky enough to be friends with your brother or your sister, which is a very unusual occurrence. Just kidding. So that's the friendship. So whoever will say later, but there are different levels of friendship, I will agree. And whoever will say later, but I have a friend who is not trouble from the point of view you're worried about, I will agree too. Because they won't be friends for relevant purposes. There are also, according to the first of two stereotypes I will mention, and you know how useful stereotypes are and how problematic they are, there is also this distinction between the type of friendship that women and girls have and the type of friendship that men have. Now, this distinction goes more or less like this. I will read now from the most famous article ever written on this topic, which was not written by me, but by a professor of theology at the University of Valparaiso next door, who comes often to the fall conference, or came, and if he's still alive, he still comes. His name is Gilbert Meyerlander, and this was published in First Things many years ago with the title, Men and Women, Can We Be Friends? I mostly disagree with it, but this is what he says about the stereotype, the first one. So these are two couples, Buzz and Libby, and Dave and Beth. This is for you, Dave. It says, Buzz and Libby, whom we see about twice a year. When we get together, Beth and Libby always wind up in a conversation lasting several days, during which they discuss virtually every significant event that has occurred in their lives and the lives of those they care about, sharing their innermost feelings. This is not to say that Buzz and I don't share our feelings. Sometimes we get quite emotional. That's not a foul, one of us will say. Or, you're telling me that's not a foul. Then he says, I don't mean to suggest that we talk about sports only. We also discuss openly and without shame what kind of pizza we need to order. We have a fine time together, but we don't have heavy conversations. And sometimes after the visit is over, I'm surprised to learn that there has recently been some new wrinkle in Buzz's life. I learned it through my wife, who tells me that he now has an artificial leg. Well, this is completely irrelevant for us, because if we're going to befriend someone of the opposite sex, we're not going to do this. So this is okay, this is cool to say, women, according to the stereotype, are... By the way, I, as you perhaps know, I gave a talk on this topic in La Fortune some years ago, and that talk was video recorded. And one time, I was at the cafeteria of my university in Argentina, and two of my students were talking in another table. You need to be careful if you're a student what you say in places like La Fortune. This was the Argentine La Fortune, because they may be listening to you. And this student was saying to his friend, this talk of Professor Legarre, he misses the point altogether. The question is not whether men and women can be friends. The question is whether women and women can be friends. Like suggesting that true loyalty is with men and those kinds of stereotypical remarks that, again, they are irrelevant. This was mostly for you to hopefully laugh a little bit. What's the main principle in this area of befriending someone of the opposite sex? The main principle is whatever works. You come to me after the talk, you tell me everything you said has been proved wrong in my life. Well, that worked for you. So what can I say? You managed to be friends with this gorgeous person of the opposite sex. Your spouse isn't jealous, your boyfriend is okay, you never fell for them. You conquered. Well done. Except that this is all what's said after the events have unfolded and elapsed. But what I will try to offer you are some prudential observations and pieces of advice for the day before, when you don't know yet if that's going to work for you, or instead is going to destroy everything you love, as it happens routinely in the lives of people. So I'm not talking for the winners who have won already, but for the potential losers who are welcome to my club. Now, because this is ex ante advice, that was Latin, by the way, as opposed to ex post, a capital aspect of the argument is that we should know how we are. How are we? But I'll get back to that in a minute. So first, some facts of life. I say first, but I've almost said half of what I need to say. Some facts of life. Fact number one, ordinarily, people experience something called ordinarily sexual attraction for persons of the opposite sex. It is a special type of attraction, the one Adam experienced for Eve. That kind of enthralling feeling. This is a feeling for a person who is soul and body. It is a soul incarnate, and the attraction has incarnate elements and spiritual elements. This is very important to understand. Physical elements, spiritual elements, but one person. Incarnate elements, physical beauty. Spiritual elements, moral, spiritual beauty. Complementarity, Karol Wojtyła, love and responsibility. That kind of attraction you experience for someone of the opposite sex with a certain age difference. That's the complementarity that may also happen when there is little physical attraction. Here comes a second stereotype, and remember that they have some truth to it. The second stereotype is women look less at the physical, men look more at the physical. And the third stereotype is as men grow older, they care less for the physical. All this could be true or maybe not. What is, I think, true is that you can fall for someone to whom you are not very attracted physically, if the person is very attractive spiritually. This is so important. I remember in La Fortune, one of the main attacks I got was, but what if you're not physically attracted by a guy, by a girl? Then surely you can indulge in the kind of friendship that you say is otherwise potentially dangerous. No. Precisely because it is the person that is attracting you. What I would like to call the package. Now, some days the wrapping of the package may be more relevant. Your eyes may be more important. Some other days, what will matter will be comfort, strength, support, sympathy, a listening heart, as we would say at the conference. Aquinas, not very famously, said, this is not very well known, I owe it to Professor Finis. He said, Thomas, I am not my soul. And I think this is important for us to remember. We are not angels. The idea of the package, I think, is important. Second fact of life. First one, sexual attraction. You need to count on that fact of life when you think about how, if you're a guy, how you relate to a guy in terms of friendship and how you relate to a girl. If you're a girl, how do you relate to a girl? How do you relate to a guy? The sexual attraction difference of the two scenarios, capital. Second, physicality and love. Adam and Eve. The more we love a person of the opposite sex, the more physicality we want. This is, forget about morality, religion. This is like a psychological law, and it is indeed the psychological law that gives the right, solid roots to marriage and to conjugal love, to spousal love, the maximum physical union between a man and a woman. Now it makes complete sense. Maximum love, maximum union. Now, what am I doing with you here, my friend of the opposite sex? Why do I find myself wanting to hold your hand when we're walking through the woods to talk about anything and everything? Why me, Martin, why do I experience this joy when I touch your shoulder or give you a hug, Mary? But yesterday, I, Martin, when I was with John, it didn't occur to me to want to hold his hand or touch his shoulder. Yes, we hugged, but you know what? That hug was, for me, it was like, hey, Now, I'm not saying that there can't be innocent hugs with a person of the opposite sex. There can be, and I wouldn't want to instill any kind of idea of making frozen the reports between people of the opposite sex. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you're going to be friends with someone, it's not going to be like a spontaneous hug that you will give them one time without having planned to, but instead you will be with this person very often talking about everything, and there'll be hugs like all the time. So then pray tell me how you will do for those hugs to be equivalent to the ones you will give to your friend of your same sex. Now, when I say hugs, it's only one example of many others that you can figure if you think of your own lives. How easy it seems to be, at least potentially, that with a person of the opposite sex we may slide in directions that we wouldn't with a person of the same sex. Our not being angels, then again, is crucial in this second sense. The angels don't touch. We touch. The more we love, the more we want to touch. This is even true between a mother and a son and, other types of love. They also have a physical dimension for good reasons. Have any of you seen the award-winning movie Past Lives? Well, only one person. Great. There is a final scene. Well, we'll talk about it later because I don't want to alienate the rest. I'll instead go on to say that, just to state the obvious at this point, that when there is potential sexual attraction, and there always is for a person of the other sex, potential sexual attraction. That's in the definition of being a person of the opposite sex. And when there is this openness to more physical contact, it is more difficult to say to that person of the opposite sex, I just love you as a friend. It is possible, of course, but it is more difficult than for Martin to say to Johnny, I just love you as a friend. The other one would be, of course, what else, But in the other case, the what else is very obvious, isn't it? Third, fact of life. Who am I? How am I? We are not the same. We were discussing this over breakfast with some friends today. How some people have a colder temperament. So they could say to me after the talk, look, I can have a friend of the opposite sex, and for me to feel anything for someone, I'm like an iceberg. I have like Dutch roots or, I want to see how the iceberg fares under the eclipse, or maybe it's without the eclipse. Because icebergs, someday, maybe they aren't icebergs, they find Titanic on the way, and you don't know what can happen. But you can certainly know that you're not an iceberg, like many people called wrongly Italians or Latin people, let's say 90% of the world. They are called by Fyodor Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov the sensualists. That's how he calls, especially Mitya, my favorite character. You see, the most problematic character is the angel, Alexei, Alyosha, for my talk. Mitya is what I would call the normal guy. How are you? How are we? Do we know how we are? Because this is important to decide the extent to which we're willing to risk, especially if we already have friends of the opposite sex, so that we cannot go there planning from scratch, but we are already into what we could call, broadly speaking, a relationship, which we want never to be a relationship. And maybe because we're married, maybe because we have a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or the other person does. So maybe we're there, so we need to know how we are. We also need to know something way easier to know, and that is whether we are free or taken in some way, whether we are attached, engaged, otherwise engaged, married. That's very important, as I said earlier, for these purposes. And then we want to remember two complementary ideas. One, it takes two to tango. So something new, an item, will never happen if the two parties don't want it to happen. This is true, and it could work against my argument. But similarly, it is true that it only takes one of the parties to break up a friendship and transform it potentially into a nightmare or into a dating relationship. Because you may be very certain of your feelings, but you may be completely misreading the feelings of the other person in this friendship. And if men or women are so different as they seem to be, then one of the parties may think that the other one feels some way and be completely in the wrong. You know, like in those situations where everyone in the room knows what's going on, but the person doesn't know. So we want to keep our eyes open to the possibility that we're wrong. You know, we may be right about ourselves. We may be wrong about ourselves too. It's so common. But even if we're right about ourselves, don't we need to consult the feelings of this friend we want to be our just friend? And isn't that difficult to consult those feelings? Don't people lie like all the time if you ask them point blank? If you say, I just want to make sure this is a friendship only, right? I mean, isn't that question even awkward in itself? Next point, and almost there now, and I would be very happy to learn from you and listen to your questions, although I'm not sure I'll be able to answer them. Intimacy and religion. This is like a coin with two sides. The topic of religion in a conversation within a friendship. It's like you could say the peak of intimacy. You know, I'm going to share with you my feelings about God, that I'm considering conversion, or that I'm about to leave the faith, you name it. Oh, this would be like, wow, these two guys are really friends. And that is true. That is true. And this is the irony. This is precisely why, if you have some kind of friendship with a person of the opposite sex, and if you want to be prudent, this is the one thing you don't want to talk about with your friend, because then you're getting into the deeper waters of intimacy and looking really at the soul. In fact, if you are in the unfortunate situation where you have a friend of the opposite sex, capital F friend, beer friend, then you'll have to be checking yourself all the time that you don't meander into such topics as religion, or how many kids do you want to have, or what kind of methods do you use, blah, blah, blah. Sadly, you'll have to discuss pizza, football, and a little bit more if you want this to stay as what it is, without sliding. Instead, with your friend of the same sex, the challenge will be different. The challenge will be, I am up to the reality of having a friend, a true friend. Now, if there is a true friend, it will be of the same sex, I have argued. But there are many people who don't have one single friend. They have buddies, people they discuss the NBA with or Barbie, but they don't have friends. Now, I hope for you to do have what now some people call best friends. Perhaps my talk should be circumscribed to the American concept of my best friend, which to me is incomprehensible, as people, especially women, typically have more than one best friend, which doesn't make any sense linguistically, I think. But then that would be the challenge, because of course another way out of the whole problem is not to have friends at all. But that's terrible. That's terrible. That's terrible. I don't advise that. Conclusion. The advice, contrary to having friends, beer friends, mooch friends of the opposite sex, is completely compatible with small f friendships with people of the opposite sex. We interact, we with women all the time, you with men all the time. College, workplace, that's real life. And you can get along well. You can have a pal, a buddy. You can make a birthday present. That's not what we've talked about. If one day, I'll say on a grim parting note, and then I open it, you find yourself in the unwanted situation of having a true friend of the opposite sex because you only realized this happening in your life too late, and now you're there, maybe you're 60, maybe it's now, then I would advise that you remember that cars have a handbrake, and sometimes you need to use it. Careful with the ice. You need to dosify not only what is bad, but also what is good. Sweet is good, but in big doses, it's bad. So the idea of dosing the interactions with this person who fulfills me, makes me happy, and poses a great threat to my existence, to my marriage, to my I don't know what, or I to hers. Let's dose it. Let's, instead of meeting once a week, let's meet once a month. Instead of meeting once a month, let's meet once a year. But it may be that all these prophylactic measures, sometimes they won't be enough. And if we know ourselves, if we look at the mirror, if we pray, we will know that sometimes the only way to solve the conundrum will be to cut altogether a given friendship of that type. This is extremely painful, and I don't think you ever want to be there, which is why I hope you won't have friends of the opposite sex. Thank you.